the world. It's so valuable that often it is protected by a bodyguard of lies. He was talking primarily about military intelligence. Natan Sharansky, the former Justice Minister of Israel, one-time political prisoner in the former Soviet Union. He'd been incarcerated for a long time in solitary confinement before he was released. He went back to his homeland of Israel and asked one day if he could return and pay a visit. And he brought his wife with him, and he asked if he could go to the prison where he had been held for so long. And he arrived with his wife, and as he was about to enter the prison, she put her arm in his and wanted to walk in with him. He took her arm out and said, "If you don't mind, let me go back in alone for a few moments, please," because it was in that solitary confinement that I really found out what life was all about. So he stepped into the prison, stayed there several minutes in that dark, confined room for a little while again, and when he walked out, he asked them if he could visit the grave of Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet physicist who had given to the former Soviet Union the atomic bomb. So he asked for a wreath, went to the gravesite, laid the wreath, and when he turned around, there was a battery of microphones awaiting with journalists wanting to interview him. Before he let them interview him, here's what he said. He said, "Mr. Sakharov gave to us here the atomic bomb. Before he died, he made this statement: I always thought the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb. I always thought the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb." He said, "I have changed my mind. The most powerful weapon in the world is not the bomb. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth." He said that to a nation that had been taught so much through living lies. And so you've got Churchill in the free world. The most valuable thing in the world is the truth. You've got Andrei Sakharov from a world where propaganda was the norm. And he said the most powerful weapon in the world is the truth. Most valuable, most powerful. Isn't it ironic that the Oxford Dictionary writers introduced the first new word from 2016 into the dictionary in 2017? Post-truth. We are living in a post-truth society, they said. What does that mean? It means two things. There is a soft definition of it, and there is a hard definition of it. The soft definition basically means that the average person today doesn't really care about the facts. They care more about their feelings. Don't tell me what the fact is. I want to know what I want to feel. And the entire electioneering process in the United States was beclouded by this phrase, post-truth, post-truth, post-truth. Are we really hearing the truth? But here's the harder definition of post-truth. Listen to me carefully. It is not merely that you don't care about the facts, you're more concerned about your feelings, but that you are even willing to use falsehood so long as in your mind you can justify that the end result is worth pursuing. You understand what I'm saying? It's not just that the ends justifies the means. You can spread lies, you can spread distortions, you can fabricate stories under the political umbrella of saying the end that you have in mind is a noble end. So post-truth is the description of 21st century schizoid man. We no longer place value upon the truth. So if Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life, and if Jesus is really giving to us all that we need to know about the truth, what does that really mean? So I want to give you two very profound statements and then draw my deductions from it. You're going to have to listen carefully. One of my great heroes after my conversion was the famed English journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. Many of you may have read Muggeridge's writings. He knew how to fabricate a scenario in order to get an end result. He said the lie was stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the handheld microphone. The lie was stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the handheld microphone. He went to the Soviet Union to do a story on Stalin. He went enamored by communism, came away totally disillusioned by it, and wrote his book, Winter in Moscow. His own life had been moving along a constant lie till he found Jesus Christ himself, and he wrote the story in his book, Jesus Rediscovered. He has two profound statements on truth. I want you to listen to it carefully because he gives us the two nuances of what truth really is all about. Listen to the first one. Truth is very beautiful, more so, I think, than justice, today's pursuit, which can easily put on a false face. That's an incredible statement, that justice can put on a false face. He said that's why truth is so beautiful. In the nearly 7 decades I have lived through, the world has overflowed with bloodshed and explosions, whose dust has never had time to settle before others have erupted, all in purportedly just causes. The quest for justice continues, and the weapons of hatred are piling up. But truth was an early casualty. The lies on behalf of which our wars have been fought and our peace treaties concluded, the lies of revolution and of counter-revolution, the lies of advertising, of news, of salesmanship, of politics, the lies of the priest in his pulpit, the professor at his podium, the journalist at his typewriter, the lies stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone, the handheld lies of the prowling cameraman. Ignatius Saloni told me once when he was a member of the old Comintern, some stratagem was under discussion, and a delegate, a newcomer who had never attended before, made the extraordinary observation that if such and such a statement were to be made, it ought not to be made, because it wouldn't be true. There was a moment of dazed, stunned silence, and then everyone began to laugh. They laughed and laughed till tears ran down their cheeks and the Kremlin walls seemed to shake. The same laughter echoes in every council chamber and cabinet room. Wherever 2 or more are gathered to exercise authority, it is truth that has died, not God. I remember when I spoke at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy in Moscow. I won't go into the details of that. The entire faculty were atheists. They were hostile. They were angry in all of their responses. My wife was sitting on one side, my colleague on the other side. They threw question after question with anti-theistic fervor, and I answered them patiently, one question after another. The hours had gone by, and I noticed there was a quietening. There was a more peaceful, ironic disposition. And as my wife and I were leaving, they all lined up. They kissed the back of my wife's hand, and they shook hands with me. And the principal of the entire institute there, which has graduated all of their leaders for the past few decades, he looked at me and he said, Mr. Zacharias, I want to say something to you. What you have told us about God today, I believe to be true, but it is very difficult to change after 70 years of believing a lie. That's exactly what Malcolm Muggeridge is talking about. The lie in the halls of the Kremlin that were there again and again and again. But here's the point I want to lead to, Muggeridge's next statement. Please listen, it's brilliant. In this Sargasso sea of fantasy and fraud, how can I or anyone else hope to swim unencumbered? How can I learn to see through and not with the eye? How do I take off my own motley and wash away the makeup? Raise the iron shutter and put the studio lights, put out the studio lights, silence the sound effects and put the cameras to sleep. Can I ever watch the sun rise on Sunset Boulevard and the sunset over Forest Lawn? Can I find furniture among the studio props, silence in a discotheque, love in a striptease, read truth of an auto cue, or catch it on a screen, chase it on the wings of Muzak? Can I view it in living color with the news, hear it in living sound along the motorways, not in the wind that rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks, not in the earthquake that followed, nor in the fire that followed the earthquake, but in a still small voice, not in the screeching of tires, either on the grinding of brakes, or the roar of jets, or the whistle of sirens, or the howl of trombones, the rattle of drums, or the chanting of demo voices. Again and again, it's that still small voice, the voice of God, if one can only catch it. What Muggeridge has said in these two statements is what I want to expand upon within the time I have. The first has to do with statements having to conform with reality. That's the primary definition of truth. When an assertion is made, it conforms to reality. That's the test of truth in a courtroom. But in life, Muggeridge goes beyond that. He says, what is truth in my life that brings meaning in this Sargasso sea of fantasy and fraud? How can I ever hope to swim unencumbered? How can I find meaning in life? This is where I believe Jesus' truth is not only unique, but beautifully demonstrable. Beautifully demonstrable. I could give you a protracted talk on this. I don't have the time to do so. May I just take 3 or 4 reasons, existentially, from the point of view of meaning, why it is that Jesus' answers are so persuasive and so convincing, in contradistinction to anyone else's claim to divine or prophetic status. His answers are cogent, conforming to reality, and his answers are existentially relevant in providing meaning. Truth and relevance are the 2 feet on which life has to walk. Can I explain to you why I believe his answers are true and relevant? The first is his description of the human condition. He talks about the total depravity of the human heart, not merely in our actions, but in our condition. We are alienated from God. There is that clenched fist on the inside. Muggeridge put it this way: the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact, at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted. It is the most empirically verifiable fact. We see it all around us, but intellectually we do not like to accept it, and we do not like to admit it, that the human heart is depraved. If you ever read books on the Third Reich and Hitler's assault upon humanity, you will find every writer making this kind of statement somewhere. They were ordinary people. They were ordinary people who did these extraordinary, damnable things. In the 80s, during the Cold War, I had the privilege of being in Poland. And I went to visit Auschwitz. I had seen concentration camps before, but I'd never been to a death camp. So I wasn't mentally prepared for what I was going to see. When you walk into Auschwitz, I think every young man or young woman, if they have a chance in this lifetime, should go to Auschwitz and spend a whole morning or afternoon there. They will come away totally changed. I remember going from room to room. You see, in Auschwitz, they were eliminating them at the rate of 12,000 every day. Every day. You saw one room where it was just housing the suitcases and toothbrushes and clothes of little children. It is the hardest room of all to endure. When you see the pictures of little boys like bony skeletons, and Joseph Mengele would do his experimentation on them, castrating them, especially twins. And these little kids, so butchered at the hands of supposedly the most educated nation at that time. And when you walk into the room where they were gassed, just before that room you see the words of Adolf Hitler. I want to see a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. Imperious, relentless, and cruel. You see, they were herded in there by the hundreds, flesh against flesh, and they were told they were about to be deloused and given a shower. So their clothes were taken off them, and they would be herded in, and that iron door shut against them, and the spigots would be turned on. And as they would hear the gas coming, the last shout that the guards would hear was somebody would shout, "Gas!" And they were gone. Ordinary men, ordinary people. If you go to the room at Nuremberg where these judges were tried, there are two remarkable paintings in that room. Behind the justices is the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And as you're exiting the room is the painting at the Garden of Eden, Satan tempting the first humans, you will be as gods. Amazing juxtaposing of two thoughts. Either we live by his law, or we become a law unto ourselves. And you've seen what has happened in the 20th century. It's been the bloodiest century in history. We've killed more in battlefields than the previous 19 put together. Ordinary people, ordinary people. Ladies and gentlemen, we would be mistaken if we look at that and the enormity of that and say that's what darkness and sin is really about. No, friend, we never solve it that way until we look into our own hearts and admit that I am a creature in rebellion against God. I've got that clenched fist inside of me. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Anybody free from those three? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Jesus said the heart of man is desperately wicked. Desperately wicked. And I say to you that description is worthy of your thought and mine. But there is a second that is so unique to the Christian faith. I mean, you heard Jade's testimony. You heard it loud and clear. Who would have ever imagined? That's the first time I've heard her tell her story. Imagine that a body that has been sexually abused, that has been abused with liquor and drugs and all of that, that has been abused with a broken home, all the brokenness around, and suddenly the grace of God breaks in. The grace of God breaks in like a shining light in a dark place. And you see yourself not in all the wretchedness that you're carrying, but in all the beauty to which He can take you. That's the story of the gospel. You will never read this in any other worldview. You ask an honest Muslim, how will you attain paradise? His or her answer will be very Quranic. Your good deeds will have to outweigh your bad deeds. You will be weighed in the balances. You ask a pantheist, how do you expect to attain nirvana or moksha? Their answer will be standard. Karma, karma, karma. You will have to pay in every life the payment for the previous wrongs. You ask a Christian, how do you know you will be in heaven? He'll tell you, you know what? I took my inheritance and squandered it. I was living in the far country. And I decided to go home, but I didn't know what my father would say to me, because I'd taken everything he'd given to me and blown it big time. And I turned around and decided to make my way home. And to my utter shock, my father leaves the confines of the home and comes running towards me to welcome me back. That part of the story would have caught the Middle Easterner by surprise. The rest of it could have been very predictable. He's blown it, he's this, he's coming back, he's going to say sorry. Have you ever seen an Eastern father? You rebel against that father, and you come along and fall flat on your face, and he will make you really do everything you could in your power to earn his reception again. Jesus said, no, that's not the father I'm talking about. I'm talking about the father who hears that his son is coming afar off, and he turns towards him and receives him. That is the surprise in the parable of the prodigal son, that the father comes out to receive him and welcome him. You ask the Christian, how do you know you will be in the house of your father? It's because of his grace and his mercy and his love and forgiveness. I never earned it. That's the reality. I'll give you a quick illustration of this and turn to my final thought. I was speaking in the Middle East. Actually, I was on a delegation and a tour, along with the former Archbishop of Canterbury. There were 5 of us. We were visiting the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leaders. It was one of the toughest trips I've ever taken in my life. And when I walked out of there, I said, who is ever going to bridge this? And on the last but one day, we were in the home of one of the 4 founders of Hamas. Solidly built guy. And I want to tell you, he was so angry through the whole conversation. He yelled and said all kinds of stuff when it was interpreted. I said, this man's been living with anger for so long. He'd been in prison for many years. He'd lost some of his sons in suicide bombing attempts and so on. And so we were just listening, and the Archbishop was the guest of honor. A few minutes left, and he looked at the 5 of us. He said, each one of you ask him one question. I asked mine. I won't tell you what it was. It was a private conversation. When that question was over, he answered it, and I looked at him and I said, Sheikh, I don't like your answer. I really don't like your answer. With your answer, there's never going to be peace in this part of the world. I said, let me just tell you one thing, sir, because I may never see you again. Please allow me to tell it to you, I said. A little distance from where you and I are sitting right now is a mountain. I said, 5,000 years ago, a man by the name of Abraham took his son up that mountain. Remember the story? He said, yes. I said, please, let's not debate which son. Let's just agree he took his son up to that mountain. And he's about to offer his son as a sacrifice, and as the axe is going to come down, God stops that arm. Remember that story? He said, yes. I said, what did God say? He was silent. God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, that's right. I said, Sheikh, very close to where you and I are sitting 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. He took his own son up that hill, and this time the axe did not stop. I said, I want to say something to you, Sheikh. Until you and I receive the son God has provided, we will be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position and power and land and prestige. He just stared at me. I said, that's right. Until we receive his son that he provided, you'll be offering your own sons, and I'll be offering my own sons and daughters for battling for power, land, position, prestige. There was pin drop silence. The Archbishop said, it's time to go. So we turned around, walked away, and as we were walking down the steps, the Archbishop put his arm around me and he said, Ravi, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. And as we went out, the Archbishop was the guest of honor, so the Sheikh was ushering him. We were walking to our own car a few yards away. But I heard feet running behind me. It was the Sheikh. I said, I'm finished. I'm going to be buried right here in Ramallah. It's all over. He's a strong guy. I've got 2 titanium rods holding my spine up. He twirled me around. Said, Mr. Zacharias? I said, yes, sir. He looked me in the eye for a good 4 or 5 seconds. He patted me on both sides of the face, kissed me on both sides of the face. He said, you're a good man. You're a good man. I hope someday I will see you again. He gave me a big bear hug. See, the answer of Jesus is so unique. God sent his Son so that you and I do not have to offer our sons and daughters for position, power, land, and prestige. He wants to win your heart. He describes it, transforms it, and the only other truth I must leave with you, when they killed him, he rose again from the dead. Now, I want to tell you something. I know you may have thought of it, but I want to remind you of it. If Jesus were a charlatan, do you know what he would have said? Kill me, and I will spiritually rise again. Kill me, and I will spiritually rise again. He didn't do that. He said, when you kill me, I will bodily rise again. He gave the kind of proof that could have been falsified if it weren't true. If he'd said spiritually rise again, how do you falsify that? Bodily. The entire Christian story could have been smothered with just one piece of evidence, the body. He rose again from the dead to offer you eternal life. The description of your condition, the provision for your malady, his resurrection from the dead. There's a lot more I could say. Let me just ask you to think about it. And I say to you, his word is truth, conforms to reality, but he brings you meaning existentially with truth and relevance. May God richly bless you as you ponder these. I'm ready to take your questions, and Adam will be joining me for that. Thank you for giving me a hearing.
Perhaps, Ravi, I could start the questioning off with a slightly personal question. You've travelled 8,500 miles to be here. You've got 3 grown children back home in Atlanta, Georgia, 4 grandchildren. I know last year you were on the road 200 days. This year, something similar. There's a great personal cost to your ministry, and I'm wondering why you do what you do.
Sometimes I wonder too. Funny you ask that, because on the way in here, which is from Houston to Auckland, is a flight a little more than 14 hours nonstop. And I wrote a letter to our supporters around the world. A lot of people have been saying, Ravi, when are you going to slow down? When are you going to slow down? And I told them, I will be slowing down. It's time to slow down. And we've built this ministry now with a team of nearly 50 apologists, Stu, in 15 different countries. I can comfortably take a step back now from administration, from leadership. I will just focus on speaking and writing, but not to the degree that I have been. That question really should be posed more to my wife. She has paid a bigger price than I have in this, although I broke my back in the process and damaged my voice, my vocal cords and all of that. And with 3 beautiful kids, all of whom are now working in the ministry with me, and 4 grandchildren. The only reason I've really done it, Stu, is I'll be very honest with you. I would not do it for anything else. There's no product in the world I would want to sell, spending this many days away from the family. There's nothing for which I would go around like this for 40-some years. I would only do it for the sake of the gospel. In the last few years, I have done more than ever, because I have never seen the world more broken and more troubled than it is right now. And after all of these decades of doing this work, We are seeing the largest and the biggest crowds anywhere in the globe you go. At Michigan State University, on a weeknight, we had 9,500 students and people attending that open forum. This is at a leading university. We have thousands coming. America has lost its way, morally, spiritually. We have never seen America more messed up and confused than it is right now. A Russian said to me last year in Moscow, he said, my only hope for the world was somehow going to come from America. He said, I have that hope no more. He said, they don't think rightly there anymore. And so we are busy because we believe the answer is in Christ, and our young people are genuinely asking questions. They are very sincere. They have been turned off by what they see as false belief. So I'm doing this, I trust, for the sake of the gospel, although from next year, even this week, I have pulled back, asked for release from some meetings that I took 2-3 years ago. It's time to really slow down. The body is telling me I need to. And so thank you for that question. The years have been tough. I would never have done it without my wife's help. We've been married 45 years. My wife's Canadian. I met her when she was 16 and I was 20. It was 6 years later we were married, and without Margie's 150% support, I would never, ever have made it. So if anyone deserves a crown for this in heaven, it'll be her, not me.
Do we have any questions of Ravi? Please. Oh. Back to the microphone, thank you.
What is the question you want to ask, Brazil? It's just about Trump. So I just was going to ask him what he thought about his mentioning about America just now. So I was just going to ask him the first time that his attorney of Nixon was saying.
Have we got a question over here, Peter? Yes, please.
Hi. Just wondering if there was a succinct way to answer our friends and neighbours who have a problem with science and accepting God. Does that make sense?
Yep. The tension between science and faith. That's a great question. I think it's a paramount question of our time. You know, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Prize, gave a brilliant speech in the 60s. He ended his speech with these words: I refuse to believe that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to believe that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe, said he, unarmed truth and unconditional love will have that final word in reality. Unarmed truth and unconditional love. If Dr. King's hope was real, then our entire educational system is flawed. Because our educational system is based on the scientific worldview of naturalism. Science does not give you the imperatives of truth and love. See, a scientist can tell you what happens when he adds this to that, but science does not tell the scientist why he should be truthful. That's a moral imperative. Truth and love are moral imperatives. So they are metaphysical propositions, or dare I say, spiritual propositions. Truth and love are indispensable to existence. I would strongly suggest to you the 2 books by my colleague from Oxford, John Lennox. One is called Has Science Buried God? That is actually, the title is Gunning for God, and the other one is called 7 Days That Define the World. He has debated Richard Dawkins and the rest of them. My colleague Vince Vitale, in the most recent book we have written, called Jesus Among Secular Gods, his chapter on scientism is worth the price of the book. The title of the book is Jesus Among Secular Gods. And Vince makes 2 very powerful points in that Dr. Polkinghorne, who was my professor of quantum theory at Cambridge, used to keep repeating, and many scientists who are Christians will say the same thing. And it is this: two of the greatest discoveries in science in recent times. Number one is that the universe had a beginning. That the universe had a beginning. Now, if it had a beginning, then it has not eternally existed. If it had a beginning, you have to look at it as either being uncaused, self-caused, or caused by another. You go through those three options, and then you come to the second discovery, that this universe is finely tuned with specified complexity. What do I mean by that? You see, it is possible for you to maybe take 100 pebbles, and it takes millions of years, and those pebbles come in a perfect triangle. It's possible. But you take all the letters of the alphabet and toss them into this stadium here. How many million years would it take to put those letters to compile the Oxford Dictionary? That's what I mean by specified complexity. When you take the early contingencies of the formation of this universe, there were so many variables and demanded constants. Just one of them, okay? Just one of them, the expansion and contraction rate of the beginning of the universe. It had to be so exact and so finely tuned that Dr. Polkinghorne, a quantum physicist, says it would be like taking aim at a 1 square inch object 20 billion light years away and hitting it bullseye. That is just one contingency, the expansion and contraction rate. You go through the early formations, go through the enzymatic makeup of the human body and the fine-tuning. And most importantly, I say to you, ask the scientists to explain to you how we got our moral reasoning. And you will find they will be grasping at straws. Jesus looked at a man who looked at him and said, "Is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar?" Jesus said, "Do you have a coin?" Man said, "Yes." He said, "Whose image do you see on this coin?" The man said, "Caesar." Jesus said, "Give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. Give to God that which belongs to God." The man should have said, "What belongs to God?" And Jesus would have said, "Whose image is on you?" The fine-tuning, the moral reasoning, the beginning of the universe. Vince Vitale makes the comment, it is not so much that science explains away God as much as it is that God alone can explain science. It's a false tension to say science or faith. Our reasoning ability and all of the exactitudes of science can be measured and predicted because this is an ordered universe, not an accidental one. So John Lennox's book, Gunning for God, or 7 Days That Define This, that Divide the World. As a scientist, he writes and talks in defense of an ordered universe, and these are false points of tension. A good scientist can also be a devout Christian. It's not an either or. People who put that dichotomy have neither understood science nor theology. Okay?
Thank you.
Stu.
Adam.
I'll just follow up really quickly. Two brief points. The first is that science itself was actually birthed out of the Judeo-Christian worldview. It wasn't birthed out of the other sophisticated ancient cultures. It's actually come out of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Happy to talk to you more about that later. Second point, if you're sick and go to a medical doctor, and the medical doctor correctly prescribes figures out what's wrong with you and then prescribes medication for you, that you can ask the question, well, and the medication makes you better, then you can ask the question, is it the medication that has made you better, or is it the doctor who has made you better? And to ask the either or is the wrong question, because the medication is the process by which you have become better, and the doctor is the agent through which you have become better. And so science talks about process, theology and faith talk about agency. And so to talk in either or terms is a completely false dichotomy. We embrace both.
Very good.
Question over this side. Thank you.
Hi there. I've listened to you quite a bit and everything, and I kind of know the answer to this, but I want to hear from you. What empirical evidence would you give about the resurrection? How would we know for sure?
Go ahead, I'll do it. I'll follow up. Go ahead. It's so good, yeah.
Thanks, Ravi. It's very kind. I think one of the key questions is when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, his disciples ran away scared. Go forward a couple of months, they are filled with boldness, preaching this gospel of the resurrected Jesus. And when they're brought before the highest authorities in the land, the Sanhedrin, the political and religious ruling class, who try to intimidate them the best they can, Peter and John, on behalf of the apostles, say, well, you answer, is it better to obey you or obey God? And so you've got this bunch of people who are incredible scaredy cats, if you like. They were terrified, running for their lives. Now they're incredibly bold. And so you've got to ask the question, what on earth happened? Or perhaps a better question, what in heaven and on earth happened to cause that transformation to occur? And when you look at the different explanations offered as to why was the tomb empty, you'll find that the best fitting answer, as I have no doubt Ravi will go on to explain, the best fitting answer, the only answer that actually makes sense, is Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. This transformation could not have occurred any other way. These people would not have invented something and then been willing to die for that which they have somehow convinced themselves of. No, they were completely transformed by the risen Jesus, and then in the process went on to transform the world. But I'd love Ravi to add something to that.
That's exactly the approach one would need to take, and let me build on that a little more. When you look at the very person of Jesus Christ, it is a whole story. It's a story of the prophecy of his birth, life, death, and resurrection. When you take a look at the prophecies of just his birth and all the prophetic voices that came together on that particular event, the very place of his birth, the prediction of the virgin birth, and all of that, how it came to be. You move through history and you go to the book of Daniel, which is written about 500 to 600 years before Christ. And you go from chapters 8 to 11 of the book of Daniel. The number of prophecies that are given of the kingdoms, one after another, starting off with the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the Roman Empire, the whole image that was seen by Nebuchadnezzar, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the feet of iron and clay. It's the Babylonian kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom, the Greek kingdom, and then the Roman and the division of the Rome. The interesting thing is he gets very specific about the Greek kingdom, how he talks about the he-goat from the west who comes and chews up everything in his tracks. Who is he really talking about? And then he says, suddenly cut down, and his kingdom divided into 4. Those 4 blending into 2, and then the 2 emerging into 1. When Alexander the Great suddenly died in his 20s with alcoholism and all of that, it was divided between 4 after that. Those 4 blended into the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires. They emerged into the Roman Empire. But then here's what he says, and a stone cut out of no man's hand that shattered that great Roman kingdom. What is it that overpowered Rome and overcame Rome? It was the Christian worldview. As the barbarians were scaling the walls and Rome was being sacked, it was Augustine who was weeping in his home at that point at the fall of the Roman Empire. But it was then that he actually penned that city of God, that the city of God would be the new kingdom that would take over, and Christendom grew out of that. So you take the prophetic schema long before the resurrection. If you only came to the resurrection, you could say this is one isolated fact. We've made so much. It is not so. It is the fact that he predicted he was going to die, and he said he was going to rise again. Even the disciples were not willing to believe that. And so what happens is on the Emmaus Road, 2 of them are walking, and the third joins them, and they don't know it is Jesus. except that he's unpacking all of history for them, everything. And they said our hearts were burning within us, and we said, we'll buy you dinner, will you come in? So he comes into the inn, and in that simple act of breaking the bread, their eyes were open. That was the brokenness of the Passover himself, the brokenness and his death. Peter, who was refusing to believe he would go to the cross, was now willing to die upside down, being crucified for him. 11 out of the 12 disciples were died a martyr's death, as Adam has so clearly pointed out that change. So you have to start with another question. What other explanation can there be? And when you look at authors who try to explain it away, you actually shake your head in disbelief and say, the simplest truth is the clearest truth, but they have to go through this nonsense of mad dogs eating up the body, or, hallucination and all of that. They're trying to explain away something that is so real. Then you take the cumulative evidence of the hundreds that saw him and the formation of the early church. I will recommend 2 books for you. One of them is by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and the other one, a debate between Gary Habermas and Anthony Flew. And Anthony Flew is connected to both of these books. When I was studying atheism in the 80s, Anthony Flew was the centerpiece of atheism, defining everything about atheism. A short while before he passed away, he said his atheism no longer remained coherent for him. He mentions both Habermas and N.T. Wright. His comment was, the best case that he'd seen for the resurrection was given to him by Tom Wright, N.T. Wright. And Gary Habermas, who became a friend of Flew, debated him several times, and you can see that in a book called Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? The debate between Gary Habermas and Anthony Flew. And you'll see the pages and pages of Near Eastern sources and evidence that Habermas will present to you. So it's not just on a whim that they hoped he would rise again. It was on the physical, bodily resurrection that has all the testimonials attached to it, built upon the cumulative evidence of the prophecies that have withstood the test of time. And it is because of the resurrection that you and I may have hope not only for the future, but also hope for this world. Thanks for asking that question. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question. Peter, have you got a questioner over here? We'll make this the last question. Thank you.
Hello. How can we be certain that the words we read in our Bibles today are the same words written by the biblical authors some 2,000 years ago?
Beautiful question. And I think another one of those hinge questions on which everything hangs. It's fascinating that you raised this question within about 5 days of our office being presented with one of the early copies of the Torah. We have it now on display in our office. And a scholar came and presented to us and was talking about the exactitude of the transmitting of the text of just the Torah across all of these centuries. When you take all of the earliest possible manuscripts, especially of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you take the gospel writers, the text that Paul uses in Philippians 2, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also has exalted him and given to him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That was the earliest hymn It was the earliest hymn. That's why Paul talks about singing to each other in spiritual songs and psalms. The earliest transmission was carried out with verbal authority and the singing of hymns one to another. The way manuscript evidence is judged, and Adam, please feel free to add after I'm finished here too. The way manuscript evidence is judged, the earliest words of, say, somebody like Homer, and the first extant copies you have of his writings, hundreds of years apart, some of them 1,000 years apart, we don't have a single word written by Socrates. Not a single word. We have Socratic transmission through Plato and then Aristotle, and yet the authority of those transmissions are so authentic that you believe Socrates said such and such and such. When you go to the writings of the New Testament, you've got these manuscripts within 100 years. As manuscript evidence goes, that is superb in terms of antiquity and manuscript writings. You can go to various museums today and see the earliest writings, and when you go back with manuscript evidence, here's what I wanted to say to you. The farther you go back towards the original, the less the so-called errors and transmission problems emerge. The closer you get to the original, the more exactitude that you find. And when I was in my graduate work, my major was doing work in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran community. We now have a passage from the Gospel of Mark going back in those days, and you will see a fragment like that. It is like taking a fragment and putting it into the perfect fitting of a jigsaw puzzle, where the lines have to be matched in just 2 words here, 3 words here, 4 words here. Those are the kinds of fragments we are now finding. So I restate to you, the heart of the gospel given in Philippians 2 was a hymn, and nobody doubts that it was the earliest hymn. No scholars doubt that, because it goes back across centuries and is found in the earliest extant manuscripts. And then you've got the narrative of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. By the time you get to the 2nd and 3rd century, you've got everything there that is intact for the whole narrative. There is no evidence in antiquity where you will find such exactitude. And may I go to say one more thing?